Um, so where should I start? We talked. This is like the last lecture and the last sort of part of our like leadership series. And I'm going to turn this down a bit. Yep. So we had Hayden talk to us in week 5 about individual behaviour, and we had Nick from Atlassian talk to us about culture. We a very long time ago, if you remember, talked about theory of constraints at the beginning of the term, and now we're going to talk about influencing behaviour. It's a topic that I think is super interesting, and even just like discussing all the stuff today of like, how do we get people to do, to comply to the event spec, or how do we get people to come to lectures, and like trying to get people to do stuff is just like one of those quite hard problems. So what I'm going to go through today is, I call it like a paradigm or a sort of framework of ways to think about how people behave and how you can change the way people behave. And I say a paradigm because this comes from a book called Bringing Out the Best in People. If you're interested in leadership, management, working with people, I think everyone should read it, even if you don't want to go down that pathway, just because it helps you better understand like yourself. It helps you understand the people around you, like in your personal life, in your professional life, and helps you become like just a better professional adult, just understanding these sorts of ideas. And that's the same thing with all of this leadership stuff, is like, we're not teaching you to be managers. We're giving you lectures about leadership so that you are a better professional person. So I hope these have been good and useful. But anyway, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, so it's a paradigm, which means that it's not the one unified string theory of everything to explain behavior. It's just like one way to think about it. Going with that physics analogy, it's like Newtonian physics, right? That's one way to think about physics, but that's not the only way. So that's why I don't want to say this is like all encompassing, but it's a good lens, I would certainly say. So what this is about reinforcement. I'm going to go through what is reinforcement, the types of reinforcement, how do you deliver reinforcement, and how does that integrate into incentives, rewards, and punishment schemes, and how that has an effect on people's behavior. So we'll start with some examples of classic incentives. These are just ones that I came up with in several different contexts. So like in a business context, you have wages and salaries, right? People get paid for their job. You might have like an annual bonus or some sort of bonus for reaching a target. If you do sales, then you might get a commission from doing a sale. Most companies have some sort of performance appraisal, which is like a quarterly or a twice a year or an annual review. Employee of the month, where every month someone's recognized as the best employee. And then these are sort of ways to reward people for good behaviors. There's also ways to punish people for bad behavior. So disciplinary procedures, whether that's being fired, taking wage cuts. I don't know if that's used as a disciplinary procedure, but there's ways to punish bad behavior. In a university context, I think about this a lot. How to get students to do stuff. Attach marks to it. It's like sugar. Here's some marks. We'll take away marks if you don't do this. Then it's like, okay, then students will definitely do that thing. So I would also hope that the activity is actually enjoyable in and of itself, and that's like intrinsically motivating. But sometimes that's a bit of a stretch. So, like there's stuff where an activity can be inherently rewarding or reinforcing. We'll talk about that. And then at home, like, if you've been a kid, or I don't know if anyone in this course has a kid. I'm not a parent, certainly, but, it's like, say, you can give your kids treat foods, lollies, junk food, whatever you want to call it, and then screen time. This is always a big one for me as a kid, and I feel like us as like the digital natives generation was like screen time became this big thing of like, oh, you can, if you don't do your homework, then you can't, go on your computer, or if you do your homework, then you get 2 hours of laptop or whatever you want to call it. So these are classic incentives, and we often just like implement these without really thinking about how we're doing it and whether it's actually effective. So that's what we're going to go through today. Very quick recap on why do people behave the way they do. Well, we talked about this in week 5. The way human behavior has sort of 3 main aspects. There's the individual, who they are, their capability, what they can do, their personality, what they're like. The organization, which is the context in which they're working, living, eating, breathing. In our context is UNSW, software engineering, CSE. And then the situation is the specifics. I'm talking to you in a lecture theatre, you're in a classroom, you're at home cooking dinner, whatever. People behave how they've been conditioned to behave. And this is the sort of central premise of today's lecture, is that like human behavior, everything's really complex and irrational and complicated. It's like, well, yes, from a certain point of view, but also people are quite predictable and people behave how they've been conditioned to behave. Now, I don't want to sort of compare humans to animals, but it's kind of like when you train a dog and you're trying to teach the dog to sit, and you get your dog treats and you say sit, and then they do that thing, and there's like a way where you like lift up the dog treat, and then they do this sit really, really cutely, and then you give them the treat. And so they learn to associate the word sit and then them doing that action with being given a dog treat. And then eventually you can just say sit, and then you don't even need the treat. It's just like intrinsically rewarding and gives them a feedback loop. So that's kind of like the way you can think about this. I'm not saying humans are dogs, but we similarly follow these patterns of behavior that generate consequences and rewards for us. Everyone's behavior makes sense from their point of view. Has anyone ever come across someone's behavior and been like, I don't understand what you were doing. It's completely irrational. You're like, why? This doesn't make sense. Most of the time, maybe accepting a couple of specific cases, but most of the time, everyone's behavior makes sense from their point of view. I see this happen a lot with students where I'm like, why would you do that? And I'm like, I understand why you did that, because I sort of understand, it's like their perspective, but it wasn't sort of it wasn't necessarily rational to me, but it might have been rational to them. And this is important to understand, because if you want to be able to change people's behavior, the first step is to understand, maybe why they're doing it in the first place. So behavior, we can talk about being a function of its consequences. And what I mean by this is it's a sort of a feedback loop where you have, here's your f of x behavior, that generates consequences, and then that feeds back into whether the behavior happens again. And what I mean by this is people do what they do because of what happens to them when they do it, right? When I turn the light on, or I turn the light switch on, the light comes on. I'm like, okay, well, whenever I turn the light switch on, the light comes on. That's why I turn the light switch on. I don't do it just for fun, just sit there tapping the thing. And performance, when it comes to talking about performance, measuring performance, dealing with people's performance, it's about what happens every single day. And you start to think that some of the incentives and some of the schemes for influencing people, we talk about things being annual and quarterly and monthly. And the reality is that if you want to influence people's behavior, this has to happen on a hourly, secondly, minutely basis. So behavioral consequences, as we said, are the things and events which follow a behavior and change the probability that a behavior will be repeated in the future. When you do something, something happens, and that consequence, as a result, informs whether a person will do something again, right? Like who's ever tried new food and you're like, oh my God, this is awesome. And then you try it again. Or like you try a food that you like and you're like, oh, I don't like this anymore. And then you stop eating it. So it changes the probability that we'll do it again. Now, most of the behavioral consequences we encounter, we don't really think about. Again, like you don't really think about turning on the light. You just do it. But it's a feedback loop, and it's a consequence which will inform how you behave in the future. So how to influence behavior? Pretty simple. This is the high level kind of thesis. If you want to make people stop doing things, you identify the behaviors that are producing the poor outcome, the thing that you don't want to happen, and you put in consequences that will stop them. So when you do this thing that I don't want you to do, here's a bad consequence. Similarly, if you want to make people start doing things, you identify the behaviors that are producing desirable outcomes. Here's the thing that I do want you to do, and arrange consequences that will positively reinforce them. Here's this reward, or here's this thing that will make you want to do it again in the future. Make sense so far? Cool. So there are 4 ways in which we can change behavior. 2 of them increase behavior, so get people to do stuff that they weren't already doing. And then 2 of them decrease behavior. They stop people doing stuff that they were currently doing. Let's go through each one. Sorry, I'm a bit nasally today. The first one is positive reinforcement. Here's an example of that. I want you all to fill out my experience when it comes out next week. So what am I going to do? I'm going to say, if you fill out my experience, or if we get 85% of people filling out my experience, you all get a bonus course mark. I need to double check this with Bethy because I haven't asked him yet, but it should be fine.
Bonus 5.
Bonus? No, I'm not giving you bonus 5.
Then I'm not going to fill it out.
Okay, that's on you. Yeah, you're lost.
No, we form a mob. Collective bargaining.
That's, I mean, the thing is, like, okay, oh, sorry, I'm going to go on my experience right now. It's useful for us, it's useful for the uni to know how good or bad, because we rewrote everything this term, so we want to know, like most courses these days, I'm like, yeah, I know what my experience is going to say, you know, in week 1, just because well, maybe not week 1, but like it's very easy to predict how things have gone, whereas this is like completely new. So we do want feedback, but anyway. Positive reinforcement, you get something that you want that you didn't otherwise have. Negative reinforcement is when you escape or avoid something that you didn't want. So I decided, actually, you know, I'm a bit too nice to the students. Let's be a bit mean. You must fill out my experience. We must get 85% of people filling out my experience, or you all lose a course mark. I'm not going to do that because I'm not horrible, but that's the form of negative reinforcement, right? You didn't otherwise have any effect to your marks, but in order to not lose a course mark, you're like, okay, I better fill out my experience. That's positive and negative reinforcement. The third one is punishment, which is where you get something that you don't want. For example, at school, someone calls someone else a name, or someone swears, and the teacher says, okay, now you have to clean the toilets. You didn't have to clean the toilets before, but now you have to. That's your punishment. A penalty is when you lose something that you have. Again, back to our parenting example, classic. I heard way too many times in my childhood, you're not allowed screen time today, or you know, you're not getting your iPad, you're losing your iPad for a week, or you're losing your phone for a week, right? It's something that you had previously, you get taken off you. That's a penalty. Penalty in teaching is, actually I was thinking about what you guys said is like, you know, if we said, okay, you must comply with the event spec or we're just going to take off 5 marks. Right, that's an example of a penalty. That's the 4 ways we can change it. And we'll talk about each of those. Now, I've kind of been alluding to this already, but human behavior you can think of as essentially given, when, then, right? There's an antecedent, a situation which precedes an action. There's a behavior, which is the action itself. And then there's a consequence, which is the outcome of the action. And that will be a reinforcer. Now, that might be a positive reinforcer, or it might be a punisher. And again, this is just given, when, then. Given this situation, when I do this, then this happens. And this is at the center of how we think about influencing behavior. Now, there's a difference between someone who can't do something and someone who won't do something. Someone who can't do something is like, I literally have no clue how to do this. It's not a motivational problem, it's a training problem. And you know, not that you'd ever actually do this, right? But it's like the classic thing is like, well, if you held a gun to their head and then said, do this, and if they still couldn't do it, it's like they literally can't do it. It's not a motivational problem. Otherwise, it is. Another good tell is like if someone did something correctly in the past, but they're not doing any more, it's like they know how to do it, just that they probably don't want to do it. So that's just an interesting distinction there. So when it comes to a reinforcer, any sort of consequence that you want to implement as a way to influence behavior, there are 3 dimensions or aspects to think about. The first of those is it being positive or negative. We've kind of alluded to this already. Positive, good from the perspective of the performer. The performer is the person doing the action. If you want someone to do something and you say, okay, I want to positively reinforce that, and you know, like you want them to, like, let's say, what's a good example? Like I can't think of one. Okay, let's say you guys didn't care about marks in some alternate universe, right? And I say, okay, I'll give you a mark for doing the my experience. It's like, well, I don't really care about marks, so that's not a positive reinforcer in that case. Similarly, sometimes you might think something is a positive reinforcer for someone, but it's actually a negative reinforcer. So then you're saying, oh, do this thing, and then you'll get this reward. And now it's like, okay, I better not do this thing because I don't want that to happen. Positive or negative. Next one is immediate or future. And this is super important. And it's, does the consequence happen as the behavior is occurring, or does it happen at some point later? And the reason for that is the more immediate the consequence, or the more immediate the reinforcement, the more powerful it is. I'll try and think of an example of this. The next one is certain or uncertain, which is the probability that it'll actually happen. Like sometimes, you know, like maybe you submit an assessment. Oh, actually, here's a good example. Let's say you have a lab, right? And you receive some auto tests. And you know that if you pass the auto test, you've got 100% in the lab. People are going to be more likely to do the lab and to finish it than if you didn't give auto tests and you're like, oh, you have to write your own tests or blah, blah, blah. Because you know that it's like, if I do this lab and I pass all the auto tests and I've got 100%, and that's certainly going to happen. And that's more likely to make someone do the lab or make someone influence someone's behavior than an uncertain consequence or outcome. Here's an example, recycling, everyone's favorite. I actually quite enjoy recycling. Maybe not recycling specifically. I like taking the bins out. It's intrinsically rewarding. Anyway, so this is from the company of the guy that wrote this book. So antecedents are trained, I assume, means like you've been told which bin to put the stuff in. You know, this is like separating recycling into different bins, like you have your paper one, your plastics one, blah, blah, blah. But then it's like the bin's labeled. Okay, so the consequence is it takes more effort. So that is a negative consequence. It's immediate. It happens right there, and it's definitely going to happen. Like you always have to sort out which bin it's going to go into. You've been warned. I don't know what go home later means. I probably should have picked a better diagram, but there's some sort of negative consequence, but it happens in the future. So it's not going to happen immediately, but we know it's definitely going to happen. And you think about this as well, right? It's like if something's going to go wrong right now, you're like, okay, I'm going to act on that. Whereas if you're like, oh, you know, I should submit my assignment in, you know, or I've got my assignment's in 2 weeks, so I don't have to worry about it, right? It's in the future, and so it has less of an effect on our behavior. Saw a TV report, okay, the consequence, I might get praised. It's positive, it's some point in the future, and then it's uncertain, like you might get praised, you might not. So we can see that putting the recyclables in the correct bins is not super reinforcing, right? Just from looking at this pattern. Here's another example. Let's brainstorm stuff. Writing tests. Okay, what are some antecedents for writing tests? So trust. This is just a side note. It's like trust is doing something when you say you're going to do it. So if you tell someone something's going to happen and then that thing happens, then they learn to associate what you say with what you do. And that's just trust, right? Similarly, if you tell someone something's going to happen and then it doesn't happen, that's a form of, I don't know if it's negative reinforcement, but it's a creating an association for them to say, okay, well, in the future, when you tell me again, I don't necessarily believe that, right? Because of what happened in the past. So I guess that's just a thing of like, be careful of over-promising and be careful of like over-communicating. And someone once to me was like, you know, this is in relation to students, is like, if you tell the student something's going to happen and then it happens, everything's, you know, they think that there's order to the universe. Whereas like, if you tell them something's going to happen and then it doesn't happen, they're like, oh, you know, super chaotic. That was an interesting note, I thought. So, okay, great. There's all these forms of reinforcement. We want it to be positive, immediate, and certain, but why? Really? Like, what is the price of using negative reinforcement? Can't I just be like the dictator that goes around like, no, don't do that, no, don't do that. You know, everyone's scared of me and that sort of thing. Let me take off my jumper and then I'll tell you. So, positive reinforcement incentivizes people to do maximum performance, whereas negative reinforcement just gets a level of performance that is enough to get by to, escape whatever you're trying to impose. And in businesses, whether it's, and this is any business, not just software, it's like you want people to do their best, right? You don't want people just to do the bare minimum to get paid or to escape, being chewed out. You want them to do their very best because that's how you remain competitive. That's how you, drive good quality, good products. That's how people make money. So there are some indicators that you can use to tell when negative reinforcement is present. Things like people get things done just in time, like right before the deadline, or most of the work happens in the last few days. It's what's called a J curve, where it's like you can think of it like a burn up chart, where here's like the amount of work, and then here's time, and then here's like the deadline, and the work goes like this: nothing, nothing, nothing. Looks like your projects, right? All this like posts on the forum in like the last days and hours leading up to the deadline. So that's an example of, it's like people are like, they just want to escape the consequences of not doing the thing, as opposed to being like, people like, when you get up to something and you're like, okay, I've got to get through this, just going to get through this, blah, blah, like an exam or something like that. As opposed to people who like wake up early and will be there early and are just doing it in their spare time. They want to be there. They, working overtime of their own free will. Again, this is all like people still exercising free will, but it's about how you put in consequences to arrange how they'll act. So again, another one similarly, like performance goes flat after reaching a goal. I always find it really fun the day after an assignment's due, just like how dead the forum is, particularly for the big courses with lots of students. And then lo and behold, if people say things like, I hate this place to work, or, people put too much pressure on us, or I have a high level of work. I mean, sometimes people are just, talking, right? That's just their way of talking about their life to other people. But sometimes it's like, if you hear a lot of that talk, then there's probably negative reinforcement at play. And then the other one is when you remove a performance requirement and then performance drops. So for example, you've got a bunch of students, they're working in like a worksheet in the classroom. The teacher leaves the classroom and they all start like talking to each other and, like throwing stuff around, and, like they don't keep doing the worksheet. It's like the worksheet probably wasn't that interesting and wasn't positively reinforcing, because the only thing keeping them from, doing that anyway was just the teacher being there. As soon as the teacher leaves, it's like, you're gone. Now, this is not to say that negative reinforcement doesn't have its place. When you need compliance or minimum performance, you just need to do the bare minimum so that people don't die, or that we don't accidentally spend billions of dollars. Negative reinforcement is fine. An example would be the security thing we had earlier in the term, where I emailed everyone, was like, make sure you're aware of this stuff. This is like a bare minimum standard that you just need to comply with. It's like, that's pretty okay to use negative reinforcement there. If you can't find, the other one is like, if you can't find anything to positively reinforce, like you have someone on your team and they go, literally all you do is show up to meetings and say nothing, then you probably need some negative reinforcement for that person, right? There needs to be some consequences. However, you need to also have positive reinforcement in place so that when they improve, they are rewarded for that, right? You can't just like stop a behavior or have negative reinforcement and then nothing else. There's a quote that I quite like, also from the book by Benjamin Franklin. Write people's accomplishments in stone and their faults in the sand. Right? It's like people do stuff, but we move on. And then when people do stuff right, then we really celebrate that. Now, the tricky thing though is, if I said, okay, everyone has to come to the lecture next week, or else you fail the course. Next Wednesday, everyone's here, right? So negative reinforcement is more likely to provide us, as the people who are doing the reinforcement, with a positive, immediate, certain than positive reinforcement. Because the thing about negative is, like, it immediately happens because people want to escape the bad consequence. Whereas with positive reinforcement, you have to wait until the next time you positively reinforce them, and then you have to see, well, did that work the next time around? So it takes longer. So that is a positive future uncertain for us. So positive reinforcement. And what I was saying before about people, getting up in the morning and working overtime and doing it just because they want to, that's what we call discretionary effort, which is the level of effort people could give if they wanted to, but is beyond what is required. And that's, again, how businesses succeed. There's several different types of positive reinforcement, and so here's some kind of categorizations. The first is natural. Again, that's just like part of your daily routine, turning on a light. When you turn the thing on the stove and the flame comes up, that's positive reinforcement. When you click on a button on a computer, when you're typing and stuff shows up on the screen, that's positive reinforcement. When I'll probably get to this in a bit, but like when you're typing on the computer, then stuff stops working, then you're just trying to hammering the keys to try and get it to do stuff. It's like, because we expect when we do something, we get this response, we get this reinforcement. Then there's created, which is intentionally added by a person, or not necessarily intentionally, but it's added by some person. And there's two types within that. The first is social. And a good example for that is a compliment, where I do or say something to another person, and that has what we call trophy value, which is to say, like if I compliment Will on, I like your t-shirt, for example, it's like, that's not transferable to Luke. Like Luke does not care that I like Will's t-shirt, for example.
And also, if Will didn't like you, he wouldn't care that you like his t-shirt as well.
Oh, I guess so. Yeah, I guess it's like, yep, that's true. I hadn't thought about it in that much depth. But it has trophy, like it's like a trophy, a trophy, you can't go and sell the trophy. Maybe some you can, I guess, but like you don't generally go and sell the trophy. It's sentimental value to you. Yes.
I'll sell this t-shirt on eBay.
Yeah.
Nick's favorite shooting shirt.
Whereas a tangible reinforcer is an object and has salvage value. So I give you a toaster or a t-shirt, you can go and sell that on eBay. Now, all tangible reinforcers should be paired with social reinforcement. I have another story about t-shirts, actually. When I was in school, I was in the cross-country team, and in my last year, the coach implemented this scheme where they had these t-shirts, and at the end of every training session or every race, they would give one t-shirt out to someone who had tried really hard or performed really well, who'd put in a lot of effort. And the point was to get them to, get people to be like, oh, I want a t-shirt, so I'm going to put in lots of effort. Again, positive reinforcement. What would have been really bad is if they just come in like say, oh, Nick got the t-shirt, and they just go like, here's your t-shirt and that's it. Whereas what they did was at the end of the race, they'd be doing the debrief, here's how we ran and we won and we lost, blah, blah, blah. It's okay. And today's t-shirt goes to Peter because he spewed when he ran across the finish line and put in a heap of effort. Sorry, didn't mean to throw you under the bus. Well done, you get a t-shirt and everyone clap, 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 and you shake your hand, blah, blah, blah. And then you get the t-shirt, and that's like in your head is like, has a positive association with social reinforcement because people, were clapping and rewarding you just by giving you like this social feedback. I have one of those shirts and I wear it like probably once a week because I really like it, and probably because of the fact that it has like sentimental value to me as well. So all tangible reinforcers should be paired with some sort of social reinforcer. The example in the book that they give is like, companies like, here's your damn toaster, now get back to work. It's like, you're not going to use that toaster. I mean, maybe you will, but you won't use that toaster readily because it's, associated with these pretty toxic memories.
I'll use the bonus of 10 grand.
When it comes to finding reinforcers for people, it's quite hard because the thing is like, you can't apply the same sort of formula to everyone because, as we talked about, everyone's different, everyone's unique, and that's awesome. That means, and again, this isn't just like for a leader or a manager to people they're employing. It's just like, when you deal with anyone any day, it's like you need to find reinforcers that work for them. And that just requires being empathetic and getting to know people and understanding them. Different people will have different reinforcers, and the way to figure out what those reinforcers are just like try stuff. I mean, most of the time, it's like if you compliment people, if you smile at them, if you do sort of, basics or social things that, most people respond to, that works pretty well. Sometimes if you want, more specific or like you want them to do something in particular, it's like you have to maybe, again, spend time getting to know them and say like, ask like, what do they want? And then later you can say, well, here's how I can get, help you improve your career by doing this thing. Again, positive reinforcement. And then observing is just like, see how what you do impacts them or what impact it has. And if that doesn't work, then try something else. So ask, try, observe. Okay, Grandma's Law. Great one. If you eat your veggies, you can have dessert. The very common technique in positive reinforcement is pairing actions that aren't intrinsically reinforcing with ones that are. Again, the example here is like, if you eat your veggies, you can have dessert. Pretty classic, thing at home for kids. Another example at home is like, if you eat your veggies, my family was always like, you have to eat all the meat on your plate in order to get dessert, which meant that only now I'm learning to eat veggies, which is heaps of fun. And then it would be things like, you've got to do your homework, and then you can have, an hour of screen time or hour of phone or whatever. Same thing. At companies, they do the example they give in the book is they say you have to reach a certain target, and if you do that within the week, like if you do that on a Thursday, you can spend the rest of the week working on your own like vitality initiatives, like quality improvement projects, and that sort of thing. And what they found was that people were just like working super hard. They're like, I want to get this stuff done so I can work on my little pet project on a Friday. And they were, working overtime. They were just like doing stuff because they really wanted to be able to work on their personal project. And that's all through positive reinforcement. So some sources of positive reinforcement. There's work-related, peer, and management-related. These aren't too hard to get your head around. Work-related is when we arrange a task so that reinforcement is automatically associated with the task. Again, this is the green tick in the CI, where, and this is the thing about programming, which I think is super interesting, and probably one of the reasons why people like it so much. Is like, if you do a commerce degree, for example, like a commerce task. I don't know. Maybe you guys, some of you guys do commerce. Sorry, I'm not having a go at commerce. But a commerce task is like you write a report and you're like, okay, cool, I wrote the report. Whereas a programming task is like you can see a website that you've made, or you can see that the stars print out in your Comp 1511 lab, or you can see that the green tick has passed. And that is like that sort of affordance and the feedback loop. You can get that instantly with software. You can get it in 5 minutes just by writing a program. I think that short feedback loop attracts a lot of people to like comp sci in general. And I make this joke about people getting baited by Comp 1511, but it's like they do the auto tests, and I'm like, you're probably like the fifth person that has been like, oh yeah, when I wrote auto test on 1511 and it all comes out with green, I'm like, it's, the dopamine is just absolutely flowing. And you're just like, it's very intrinsically rewarding. So if you can make work like that, if you can make people do stuff, and right, this is all delivering business value and creating revenue for the business, is like if you can associate that with stuff that just makes people want to do it, that's awesome. Sometimes that's hard, right? Like imagine if you run a cleaning company, or if you like a manager of a team that like processes invoices manually, right? It's like maybe quite boring. So thinking of ways to improve that just like employee experience is a big thing. From a software engineer point of view, when I worked at Atlassian last year, I went from working on a microservice architecture at 9 to working on the Jira monolith. And because they call it the dev loop, or your development loop, is just like the time you spend writing code, test it, push to the CI, all that sort of thing. That's way longer on a monolith than it is on microservices, right? Just because there's more code, CI takes longer. It takes longer to run linters and checkers and all that sort of thing. Is like you don't get that positive immediate certain in the same way that you do on a small service. And that's a big thing for developer experience, because you want people to just code and tick, move on, next one, and just like churn through stuff. Whereas if you're waiting ages for Jira to compile or blah blah blah, it's immediately just like less, just not as much fun. So this isn't about necessarily making stuff fun, but it's about putting these psychological factors in place to make work rewarding. However, that's not all we have. We also have peer-related reinforcement, where, and this is the thing, is like if you're a manager, you can't be everywhere all at once delivering reinforcement to people and being like, good job, and grow, all that stuff, because there's only one of you, and then you've got to do other stuff as well. So the people who are best in position to deliver this positive reinforcement are peers, right? They can observe performance more closely, they can do it more often, but just because they're there. And then management related is from managers. I didn't finish that slide, that's okay. All right, so we've talked about how to use positive reinforcement to increase behavior. What about decreasing behavior? How do you get people to stop doing stuff that you don't want them to do? We talked about punishment and penalty. Punishment, you get something that you don't want. You get something that you don't want, and penalty is that you lose something you have. Now, inadvertently, in many situations, we punish behavior that we actually want people to do. And often we do it because we haven't thought about it from their point of view. An example they give in the book is like a retro, like a sprint retrospective or something equivalent, where the company has two focus groups, and their job is to generate ideas about how the company could be better. And I think it's like manufacturing, like a manufacturing plant or something like that. And at the first one, the vice president of the plant comes in and sits in on the meeting, and then in the first few minutes, people will say, oh, I think we should do this. And he'll go, oh, no, we can't do that because of blah, 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 blah. And then someone else says, oh, we do this. And no, we can't do that because blah, 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 blah. That group, they had 6 suggestions from this working group. The other one that didn't have anyone from the management present came up with 50. So what was happening is that and this isn't because anyone had any bad intentions. It's just like, they were just like, oh, I want to explain, I want to give advice. But what that did was inadvertently essentially punish people for speaking up, as opposed to positively reinforcing them. This is why when we run tutor retros, I try to not be like, okay, we're not doing that, but try to be like, just like take all the suggestions and let the ideas come in. And maybe the ideas will be good, maybe they're bad, and then synthesize them later. Anyway. And then the other one is don't shoot the messenger. This is a big thing in, any situation where it's like, if you don't feel safe to go to someone to say, here's this problem, then there's a big safety culture problem, maybe wherever you're working, because if you can't bring up, here's this problem, and maybe this has an effect on people because I'm worried that I'm going to get chewed out, is that it's like, I'm just, it's like, don't shoot the messenger. I'm just the messenger, the bringer of bad news. That's again speaks to more systemic sort of cultural problems in organizations, but we don't essentially want to punish or penalize behavior that we actually really want to positively reinforce. Now, when you do punish someone, delayed punishment, similarly as we talked about with reinforcement, is that's if you do something bad, and then 5 minutes later you go, okay, cool, I moved on with my life, and then a week later or a month later or a year later, the consequences come in, that won't be as effective as you do something bad and you immediately receive the punishment. Similarly, if a behavior is punished, it should be paired with a positively reinforced behavior, because punishment makes you stop doing stuff, right? You want people to start doing good stuff in place of that bad behavior. So all the good stuff needs to be positively reinforced. And then the last, just a minor point, is recovery when an old behavior resurfaces. An example, people who are addicted to alcohol and drugs, there's relapses and that sort of thing. Okay, extinction. This is one of my favorite parts. Is you can influence behavior by doing nothing. Because when you tell a joke and no one says anything, you don't get any response. You don't get told that was inappropriate or blah, blah, blah. Usually because the joke, most contexts I've seen is someone tells a joke that's inappropriate and then everyone knows that the politically correct thing to do is just do nothing, because it's you don't want to go and be that joke was inappropriate and then you start an argument. It's just let's just ignore it. And it's as the joke teller, you're oh shit, no one found that funny. I'm probably not going to tell that again. And that's a classic example of this extinction. So formally, it's when we withhold or we don't deliver reinforcement for previously reinforced behavior. And this happens all the time, and not necessarily in a good way. I've seen examples at companies where someone has an idea or initiative, and then they're like, I'm super passionate about it. They try to drive it, and then the team just kind of like goes like, oh yeah, cool, and then doesn't really do anything. Like they don't get a lot of uptake or buy-in, and that's often for a bunch of reasons. But then it's like, okay, well, as the person who comes up with that initiative, you're like, okay, well, no one really cared, so I'm not going to keep going with it, right? Like you want people to respond and to give feedback to, an idea or any sort of thing. I mean, similarly, it's like I'm sure you've all been in situations where you've said something and then you're just completely ignored, and you're like, okay. And these are all, again, both in professional and personal settings, ways that behavior changes, and it's just by doing nothing in this case. This is also the classic, like, just ignore it and it'll go away. Now, there's certainly a time and a place for extinction. I, to be completely honest, sometimes use extinction in courses where, not in this course because you guys are all amazing, but other courses where students have like said something and I'm like, well, I could respond and I could, not get into an argument, or they've said something about some like part of the assessment or something, and I'm like, well, I could explain why the things are the way they are, but I don't really want to get into not a fist fight, but a verbal fist fight on the forums with a student, and so I literally just ignore it. And sometimes, most of the time, they just drop it because it probably is unreasonable. But that's not to say that like ignoring stuff is always the right way to go about things. And certainly, like I've seen so many times cases where there's behavior that is just ignored, and I'm like, this is not on, and you're just doing nothing, and nothing happens, and there's no consequences, and so people just keep doing it, right? Or people just keep doing it, or people stop, or it essentially can be problematic, because the thing about like extinction is that people tell you the inappropriate joke and then they don't get a response from you. It's like sometimes they still go and tell it to other people. So again, that's just an example, but time and a place, like everything. So some signs of extinction. Extinction burst. Again, this is like when when your computer dies. I have this problem. This computer's getting a bit old, and sometimes it dies, and then I'll like press it to try and turn it on, and it does nothing, and then I'll just like press, like that will actually do anything, which it never does. And similar thing with the lift button, where it's like you press it and it doesn't work, and you keep pressing it, you get this sudden burst of behavior to try and like see if it works as a last resort, and then you're just like, okay, I give up. The example they give in the book is I think it's like the author goes to babysit some like friend's child, and the child is like he's like, the parents are like, this kid has to watch half an hour of Elmo before going to bed, and like you put him to bed and then he'll like start wailing, and you're like, okay, we have to show him Elmo, and then he'll go to bed. And the author's like, no, I'm not having any of this. So he puts the kid to bed, and then sure enough, the kid starts wailing. And then he just doesn't do anything. And then he just like, okay, kid stops. And then it starts again, and it becomes more, emotional and erratic. And at most point, at this point, parents get worried, right? And then they go in and they give the kid exactly what they want, which is to get attention. And then, it all like, starts up again because it's been positively reinforced. And then eventually, after ignoring for a period of time, they've gone through this extinction burst where they've been super emotional, they've been a bit erratic, and then every so often there's like a resurgence, just like test to see if it'll work again, and then it stops. And I think in the story, the kid went to sleep. But again, this is pretty normal, like human behavior that happens all the time. And this is a sign that a behavior is becoming extinct. Okay, that's the bulk of the theory. These are kind of, we've talked about most of these throughout, but here are some errors when it comes to delivering reinforcement. First of those, perception. We talked about that. Just because you find something reinforcing or rewarding doesn't mean the person that you're trying to influence their behavior doesn't mean they'll find it the same way. So we need to be empathetic. We need to think about it from their perspective. It has to be contingent. It can't be like, I was going to bring lollies to the lecture today to illustrate this better, but I forgot. But I say, oh, if you come to the lecture, then you'll get lollies. Well, people are like, well, I can get lollies, you know, I can go down to Kmart, Coles and buy some. And it's like, it's not contingent. So it has to be if and only if the desired behavior, then I get the reinforcement or I get the reward. Like if and only if we get to 85% my experience, then everyone in the course gets a bonus mark. It can't be just like, oh, you can also get a bonus mark on the course by, I don't know, doing your blog for this week, for example. Then there's delay. We talked about that. Again, optimal reinforcement is immediate and not in the future. It also has to happen frequently, where like you can't go, oh, I tried reinforcing this person and it didn't work. It's like, well, you got to try it and then you do it again and again and again. It's got to be frequent. It's got to be repetitive. Another thing, this is again a sort of trick of Mother Nature, is the 5-to-1 rule, which is to say that, and you probably many of you have heard this before, is like if I, give 5 positive remarks, and then I give 1 negative remark, that's the same equivalency, right? Like it takes 5 positive remarks to make up for 1 negative remark, just sort of in a person's emotional affect. So in any sort of situation, it's like, think about what's your ratio of positive to negative reinforcers or positive to negative remarks, because it's like, well, if you have a 3-to-1 or 2-to-1 or a 4-to-1 or like, 1-to-2, right? For every 1 positive remark, you're making 2 negative remarks. And so, well, probably your like emotional affect on people isn't that great. So that's another thing to consider. This next one, another favorite of mine. You're trying to compliment someone on something, or you're trying to deliver reinforcement, and you say, okay, let's say I'm looking at a student's code, and like, I thought your style was great, it's very cleanly written, it's good, blah blah blah, but it's not correct, or it didn't pass the auto tests. And as soon as you say the word but, everything that came before the word but is this big bubble. The bubble pops and can basically ignore it, right? Is that like if you, and you've all heard this before, so you hear the word but or however, it's like everything that came before the but is not the actual point of what was being said. And so you take it as some sort of negative remark rather than a positive remark. That's why literally when I give feedback, I actually just avoid saying the word but. I say, here's the things you do well, here's the things that you can improve on, blah, blah, blah. And reinforcement is different to feedback. I do want to stress that, but don't understand. That's a very common thing that happens, is that when you think you're delivering positive reinforcement, it's actually interpreted a different way because you've created this sort of dichotomous distinction between good stuff and bad stuff. And similarly, it's like if you're trying to punish someone, you're like, okay, don't leak your API credentials on ChatGPT. You don't go and say, oh, I love how you've been using ChatGPT recently, but don't leak your API credentials on it. It's like that's kind of confusing. Just deliver the punishment and then separately deliver reinforcement for good behavior. Similarly, it's like the shit sandwich for punishment doesn't work. Feedback again is different because that helps like put into context what feedback's being received. Shit sandwich is pretty good for that. But avoid pairing positive reinforcement with punishment. Okay, so let's go through these now and figure out which one's these. What are these? Positive immediate certain, positive future uncertain. Let's find out, and we can kind of get a measure from that of how effective these systems are. Okay, the last thing, the book makes an interesting. This was written in like the early 2000s, and talks about the Nintendo generation, which is like the millennial, like the one before our generation, the millennials. And they're like, oh, why do we do all this reinforcement stuff? Back in my day, everyone just did their job. The first thing is there's probably BS. Like there were problems then, there are problems now. Like, things change, but then things also don't change in a certain way. At the end of the day, we are conditioned to behave the way we do. And you think about, I've talked about screen time and stuff growing up, but it's like our generation and definitely the generation that are coming after us. It's like we've been very, very heavily conditioned by technology around reinforcement. So like think about how many reinforcers you get when you're playing a computer game, which you're watching YouTube, when you're on TikTok, right? There's this very, very short feedback loop that is, if you think about it, like positive, immediate, certain. And then it's like, you know, it's no wonder why kids have trouble concentrating in class. Like you think about the amount of reinforcers they get in a classroom environment to the amount of reinforcers they get when playing a computer game. Now, I'm not going to say this is what I personally think because I don't really know much about it. But in the book, they say, they're like, well, you know, there's a rise in ADD, attention deficit disorder. But kids who have ADD, or some kids who have ADD, it's like they can spend hours and hours playing computer games, but then they can't concentrate in a classroom. And according to the author, that is all to do with the fact that it's about the rate of reinforcers per hour and per minute. So, and again, this is why I think that people like, come to CSE so much, or they want to do coding, is because it's very intrinsically reinforcing. It's a fun activity that gives you a lot of immediate reward. Now, there's also things like the fact that, I talk about this in Comp 2511, but there's things you do now, like sacrifices you make now to help you in the long term. And it's like brushing your teeth. I mean, brushing your teeth, you get a PIC from like having a nice breath or whatever. But some things where it's like you just kind of have to do them, and it's not because you'll get an immediate, dopamine boost now, but you will later, or you will get some reward later, or you'll prevent some sort of punishment later. So that's a hard problem as well. It's like, how do you deal with the things, how do you get people to do the things that aren't immediately reinforcing? Like, I think that, the fact that people don't really come to lectures a whole lot, or some people don't come to lectures a whole lot, is going to, like, they'll graduate and they'll get a job and they'll be fine, but then they just like won't know as much and they won't be as capable, people, and that will affect them in the long run. So we talk a lot in teaching about like helping the students' future selves. And it's why I think sometimes things like my experience and metrics is a huge thing as well in all this, is like, once you start measuring something, that also generates like a form of reinforcement. It's like you optimize a metric, like you pass the test and you get some sort of, psychological reward. So it's like my experience as a metric is like all you're measuring is how happy the students were about the course now. It's like, well, what about later? And that's really hard to measure. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying I have a plan for it, but these are all things to think about. So yeah, food for thought. I hope you found this interesting and valuable. If you, again, found this stuff cool, found stuff interesting, read this book. It's called Bringing Out the Best in People. We kind of went through the main, like the central section where he talks about the theory of positive reinforcement, negative, punishment, penalty, extinction, all that sort of stuff. The start, he talks about kind of the scientific theory behind it all, and then the later part is putting it into practice in a business context. So worth a read. Otherwise, I hope you found that interesting. And that's it. That's the last lecture. Are there any questions? Nope. Okay. Did anyone? No one joined us online, which is sad because the thing didn't work. But that's okay. I'll see if, let me just see if anyone's on the forum.